Cowboys on the trail didn't eat to enjoy, they ate to endure. Forget variety, forget freshness. Survival meant building every meal from ingredients that wouldn't spoil, from food so dense they sometimes needed soaking just to chew. In this video, we're diving into 15 meals that carried cowboys through brutal drives. Each one wasn't just food, it was an answer to a survival problem. By the time we finish, you'll know exactly what diet sustained cowboys across the Wild West when comfort wasn't an option. On the range, the problem was simple. Cowboys needed cheap, portable fuel that wouldn't rot before the herd reached its destination. The solution came in the form of beans, most often pinto beans, packed by the sackful into the chuckwagon. They were dry, dense, and calorie-rich, a guarantee of protein and fiber when fresh food was out of reach. Cowboys leaned on them so heavily that camp chatter even gave them nicknames: prairie fuel for their strength, and the joking whistleberries for the after-effects. Cooking them was a daily ritual. Each morning, the cook poured dried beans into a pot of cold water and set it aside. As the wagon jolted across the plains, the beans slowly absorbed moisture, softening bit by bit while the cowboys worked the trail. By evening, that same pot went over the fire, simmering in a cast-iron Dutch oven until it thickened into a stew sturdy enough to stretch across more than one meal. Leftovers didn't go to waste. Some were mashed into patties and refried, a way to make the same food feel almost new. For hungry men, beans weren't exciting, but they were trusted, filling, and impossible to ignore, especially once paired with something heartier that added salt and fat to the mix. Long days of hard riding under the sun meant cowboys sweated out salt almost as fast as they burned through energy. That loss created a constant risk of dehydration and fatigue, and the chuckwagon needed an answer. Salt pork and bacon filled that gap. Unlike modern smoked bacon, salt pork was unsmoked belly meat packed in heavy layers of dry salt or stored in brine-filled barrels. The result was a dense slab of fat and meat that could endure heat, dust, and weeks of travel without spoiling. Its sodium replaced what cowboys lost through sweat, while the fat supplied slow-burning calories that kept muscles working through the drive. The meat itself was nearly inedible straight from the barrel, pale, tough, and brine-soaked, so cooks often rinsed or soaked it first to draw out some of the salt. Sliced small, it found its way into beans, stews, and biscuits, turning otherwise bland staples into something more sustaining. The real secret lay in the grease. Rendered fat, fried breads and corn dodgers in cast-iron skillets, giving each bite concentrated calories and a rare trace of flavor. No one looked forward to eating it, but every man depended on it. Still, even salted meat couldn't solve the need for bread that lasted on the trail. Hardtack quickly earned its reputation as the hardest bite on the trail. Cowboys nicknamed it tooth dullers, and for good reason. The dry, square crackers could grind down a man's jaw after a day in the saddle. Breaking into one felt less like eating bread and more like testing your teeth against stone. Despite its toughness, hardtack mattered. It was made from only flour, water, and a pinch of salt, then baked until every trace of moisture was gone. That was the secret. Without moisture, it resisted mold and rot, making it a reliable source of calories for months on end. First issued to soldiers during wartime, hardtack later found its way into the chuckwagon, where it became the closest thing to bread that cowboys could count on across weeks of driving cattle. No one pretended to enjoy it, but they found ways to make it tolerable. Some dunked a square in hot coffee until it softened enough to chew, while others crumbled it directly into stews, letting the broth disguise its bland, gritty texture. In the end, hardtack wasn't prized for flavor. It was respected for endurance. And around the fire each night, there was one other staple just as enduring, but far more welcome. Coffee was more than warmth in a cup. On the trail, it was fuel that kept men moving when exhaustion threatened to slow them down. Before daybreak, when the fire was lit and the herd still quiet, the first pot often set the rhythm for the entire camp. Without it, men grew short-tempered, and the long ride ahead felt twice as heavy. Early on, Roasting beans over a campfire was tedious and uneven, but everything changed in 1868 when John Arbuckle introduced roasted and sugar-glazed beans sold in 1-pound packages. This sealed in flavor and prevented them from going stale, making coffee far easier to transport. Arbuckle's brand became so popular that many chuckwagons wouldn't hit the trail without it. Brewing was simple. Grounds went straight into boiling water, steeping until the result was jet black and bitter. Legend says this brew was so potent it could float a revolver, a bit of trail folklore that captured just how strong cowboys demanded it. That strength mattered through cold night watches and endless days in the saddle. Yet coffee was more than caffeine. It was ritual. Cups passed around the fire, steam rising as men shared a moment of calm. But for all its importance, the chuckwagon still held something rarer, a taste of sweetness. Dried fruit gave cowboys a rare break from the steady grind of beans, bread, and salted meat. Apples, raisins, apricots, and prunes were light to carry, slow to spoil, and could be eaten straight from the sack when a quick burst of energy was needed. For men used to salty or bland meals, the sudden sweetness wasn't just pleasant. It was a lift in morale that made a long day feel a little shorter. Practical value backed that pleasure. Life on the trail offered almost no fresh produce, which put cowboys at real risk of scurvy. While dried fruit was no cure-all, it delivered scarce vitamins that helped reduce the danger, giving the cook one more tool to keep a crew healthy through weeks of work. A small bag of rehydrated prunes or apricots provided more than taste. It was a safeguard against weakness that could endanger the drive. Cooks learned to stretch those rations with care. Steamed cobblers and puddings appeared when dried apples were softened in water and combined with biscuits or flour. Even a few raisins worked into morning bread transformed the meal into something memorable. And while fruit lightened camp life, heavier supplies carried their own kind of excitement. Canned goods carried a different weight on the trail, literally and figuratively. Unlike dried staples, tins of peaches, tomatoes, or condensed milk were bulky and heavy, so they rarely traveled far with the chuckwagon. Most often, they arrived only when resupply wagons caught up, making their appearance infrequent and all the more prized. When a lid was pried open, the camp's reaction was unmistakable. Sometimes cheers, sometimes quiet grins, but always relief. After weeks of salty pork and starchy beans, even a spoonful of peaches in thick syrup felt like a reminder that the outside world still existed. Tomatoes were just as welcome, their acidity cutting through the monotony of stews, while condensed milk transformed bitter cowboy coffee into something almost indulgent. These cans offered more than novelty. They lifted spirits and gave weight to the idea that leadership cared enough to provide small comforts. A single tin could turn a meal into an event, bringing men together in appreciation of something rare. But preserved luxuries, no matter how sweet, never replaced the excitement stirred by food that was freshly caught, cooked, and shared on the spot. Fresh game was one of the few chances cowboys had to taste meat that hadn't been salted or dried in advance. Unlike the herd they drove, which represented the rancher's profit, game could be taken freely. Killing a healthy steer was avoided unless it was lame, sick, or too young to keep pace, so fresh beef was rare. That left deer, rabbit, or wild turkey as the best chance to break from routine. When one of these animals made it back to camp, the change in supper was immediate and noticeable. Still, hunting came at a cost. Every hour spent tracking or dressing game slowed the drive, and trail bosses discouraged delays. That meant opportunities were seized only when chance lined up, a rabbit darting close to camp, or a deer wandering across the line of march. These moments were brief interruptions, but they provided calories that beans and bread couldn't match. Cooking methods were plain and efficient. Venison strips roasted directly over the fire, or fresh meat was stewed with beans and chili powder when available. Even a small rabbit boiled down into stew boosted morale. That mix of necessity and chance applied to smaller prey, too, often caught in the quick moments between miles on the trail. Birds offered another source of fresh meat when luck allowed. Prairie chickens and quail were the most common, turning up unexpectedly along the trail. Cowboys didn't get many chances at them, but when they did, no shot or snare went wasted. Every bird caught meant protein that didn't come from a sack or barrel. They were scarce for good reason. The constant push of cattle herds across the plains scattered most wildlife, driving it away long before a cowboy could get close. Stopping to hunt risked slowing the drive, so birds were never part of the plan, just a bonus when opportunity came. That's what made them so valued. The meat might not fill every stomach, but the fresh taste was worth celebrating after weeks of the same staples. Cooking was kept simple. Birds were plucked and roasted over open flames or pan-fried in pork grease, a method that gave them more richness than beans or bread could ever offer. Some cowboys joked that prairie chicken tasted like dust and string, but nobody passed on the chance for real meat. Fresh catches like these reminded the crew how much difference even small foods could make. And out on the trail, the same was true for bread. Sourdough bread and biscuits were the real measure of a trail cook's skill. More than any other food, they showed how survival and ingenuity met at the chuckwagon fire. Without packets of yeast or refrigeration, the cook relied on a sourdough starter, a living culture of flour and water that fermented naturally, creating the rise that turned plain dough into bread. Keeping that starter alive was an everyday task. Fed and stirred regularly, it had to be protected like a tool of the trade. On cold nights, cooks sometimes even slept with the crock tucked close to keep the yeast from freezing, not out of sentiment but because losing it meant weeks of nothing but flatbread and paste. Protecting the starter protected the promise of fresh biscuits, a reward that could anchor a day's hard labor. With the starter ready, Dutch ovens set over hot coals produced golden biscuits, while pan breads rose in simple iron skillets. Cowboys split biscuits open to sop up gravy or layered them beneath fruit to build rough pies. The routine turned basic flour into warmth, variety, and consistency, a small comfort carved out on the move. But even sturdy bread had limits, and the trail demanded foods that could last far longer than dough ever could. Jerky was the trail's most dependable meat, valued not for softness, but for survival. Cowboys prepared it from lean strips of beef or buffalo, cutting them thin, salting heavily, and drying them in the sun or over a low fire. The process was practical, built on preservation methods long used by indigenous peoples whose traditions of drying and smoking and even making pemmican showed how meat could be carried for months without spoilage. Cowboys adapted those lessons into their own form of trail insurance. The results varied depending on the source. Buffalo jerky carried a stronger, gamier taste and a tougher chew, while beef jerky offered a milder, more familiar flavor. Both provided the same necessity, portable protein that stayed good through heat and dust long after fresh meat failed. Durable and concentrated, jerky was easy to keep in a saddlebag, ready when a man couldn't stop to cook. Eating it straight was a fight for the teeth, so cowboys often softened jerky in water, coffee, or gravy before adding it to stews. This turned dry strips into something more like tender meat, giving the crew a break from endless gnawing. But protein alone couldn't sustain the drive. Cowboys also leaned on staple grains that filled bowls at little cost. Rice and cornmeal were the quiet engines of the trail kitchen, dependable carbohydrates that carried little glamour but offered enormous value. Lightweight compared to canned food and less prone to spoilage than flour, they filled the gaps when protein ran short and ensured that no man rode on an empty stomach. Easy to store, cheap to buy, and simple to cook, they became some of the most consistent staples a chuckwagon could rely on. Cornmeal was especially prized for its versatility. The most famous form was the corn dodger, made by mixing cornmeal with salt and boiling water, then shaping the mixture by hand. Dropped into hot pork grease, each piece fried to a tough golden crust around a soft interior, yielding a filling fritter that was portable and full of energy. Cornbread also made regular appearances. baked in Dutch ovens into dense loaves that paired well with beans or stews. In both forms, cornmeal reflected the Southern and Mexican influences on cowboy cooking. Rice served more as a stretcher than a centerpiece. Boiled with chunks of salt pork, it absorbed fat and salt along the way, turning a small amount of meat into something hearty enough to share among many. But as steady as these staples were, cowboys still longed for food with real bite, ingredients that carried sharpness, freshness, and variety, even after long weeks on the trail. Onions and potatoes were among the few fresh staples that could survive the trail. Their thick skins and hardy nature gave them a shelf life far beyond most vegetables, and in a world ruled by dried beans and salt pork, that alone made them precious. Still, even these tough foods weren't invincible. Kept in sacks or ventilated containers, plenty spoiled along the way. Every onion or potato that lasted was one more fresh ingredient to break the monotony of stored rations. They offered more than variety. They carried real nutritional strength. Potatoes supplied dense starch that rebuilt energy for men worn thin by long hours in the saddle, while onions added trace vitamins that helped prevent diet-driven illness. For cowboys who risked scurvy and fatigue, a pot with these vegetables inside meant calories and nourishment that could not be replaced by flour or jerky. Their uses were simple. Potatoes might be boiled soft, fried into golden slices, or dropped into a stew to give it body. Onions were chopped into beans or mixed into skillet dishes, adding sharpness that lifted an otherwise flat meal. The smell alone drifting through camp could pull men to the fire, and once that fire was set, cooks sometimes reached for another solution to monotony, flavors that cut deeper than starch or sharp vegetables ever could. Chili peppers and spices were the closest thing cowboys had to variety. A pot of beans that might otherwise taste flat took on heat and depth once a handful of dried chilies hit the fire. That small addition could turn a routine supper into something fiery enough to be remembered, and men looked forward to those nights when spice brought real anticipation to the camp. The source of that flavor was no accident. Mexican vaqueros, whose traditions shaped much of cowboy life, carried dried chilies and spice techniques north. From their practices grew the trail's most famous dish, the bowl of red chili con carne. Tough, inexpensive cuts of beef simmered with hot chilies until tender, producing a dish hearty enough to satisfy and flavorful enough to stand apart from every other stew on the trail. Scarcity kept spices precious. Small in weight, but enormous in effect, a pinch of seasoning could lift weeks of monotony from dried beans or salted pork. Even the smallest stash of peppers or herbs was guarded carefully, valued more for morale than for bulk. But when supplies did run out, as they often did, cowboys needed another way to preserve a sense of ritual and routine, even if it meant brewing something far less satisfying. When coffee supplies finally disappeared, cowboys turned to whatever the land could offer. The craving for a hot drink at dawn was too important to abandon, so they brewed substitutes that mimicked coffee in form, if not in taste. Chicory root was the most common choice. Dug from the ground, roasted until it browned, then ground and steeped over the fire. In a tin cup, the dark, bitter liquid looked enough like coffee to keep the ritual alive. Dandelion root served much the same role. Pulled from the soil, roasted until brittle, and crushed into powder, it produced a sharp, earthy brew. Cowboys never mistook it for the real thing, but that wasn't the point. The warmth in hand and the routine of passing cups around the campfire mattered more than flavor. A steaming drink kept eyes open on watch duty and gave men a small sense of normal life in an environment where normality was scarce. Even with their acrid taste, these substitutes carried weight as morale builders. On the trail, survival wasn't only about calories. It was about keeping body and spirit steady. And when not drinking from a cup, cowboys often stooped lower, turning to the ground itself for the next source of sustenance. Wild greens and foraged foods gave cowboys a chance to break the sameness of beans, bread, and pork. Dandelion greens, wild onions, berries, and sheep sorrel were among the most common finds, and each offered trace nutrients that stored rations lacked. Even in small amounts, these plants mattered. Green leaves supplied vitamin C and iron, berries brought natural sugar, and wild onions sharpened the taste of otherwise flat meals. Foraging did more than add flavor, it helped ward off sickness. A diet built almost entirely on dried meat and flour made scurvy a constant threat, and fresh plants were one of the only defenses. A bowl of beans with chopped onions or a stew enriched with greens carried quiet medical value. Cowboys, along with their cooks, learned much of this from indigenous peoples, whose knowledge of edible plants made the difference between survival and weakness. One of the most creative uses came with sheep sorrel, a wild herb with a lemon-like tang. Cooks turned it into sheep sorrel pie, where its sharp flavor stood in for scarce citrus. The dish wasn't fancy, yet it gave the men both variety and a rare dose of vitamin C. These modest harvests showed that survival depended on more than bulk rations. It required ingenuity and the land's hidden offerings. Cowboy meals were built on necessity, not comfort. Beans, hard bread, pork fat, and bitter coffee carried men through weeks of labor, each chosen for endurance rather than flavor. Alongside them came starches like rice or cornmeal, preserved proteins like jerky or salt pork, rare sweets from fruit or sugar, and the occasional touch of fresh greens. Together, these stood as solutions to the constant threat of hunger and exhaustion. The chuckwagon was always a balance of preservation over luxury, and the cook's ingenuity often meant the difference between success and failure. In the end, survival on the trail came down to one figure: the worn cook transforming scarcity into fuel for the drive. Which of these frontier meals would you try? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe if you'd like more deep dive history from the Old West.